The tattered American flag hung limply in the humid summer air over the Pusan perimeter, a small pocket of resistance in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. By August 1950, merely 2 months after North Korean forces had stormed across the 38th parallel, the situation for United Nations forces appeared dire. Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker's 8th Army clung desperately to this final defensive position, a semicircle roughly 50 miles deep and 100 miles wide, with their backs pressed against the Sea of Japan. "We will stand or die," Walker had declared to his beleaguered troops, instituting a policy that would become known as the Stand or Die Order. The scorching heat of the Korean summer only exacerbated the misery of the soldiers, many of whom were young Americans who had never expected to fight in this distant land. Outside this fragile perimeter, Kim Il-sung's North Korean People's Army, NKPA, had already captured Seoul in just 3 days and swept through 90% of the peninsula with shocking speed. Armed with Soviet-made T-34 tanks and hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, the NKPA had overwhelmed the ill-prepared South Korean forces, and the hastily deployed American units pulled from comfortable occupation duty in Japan. According to contemporary accounts in the New York Times, the early North Korean advance was described as one of the most successful blitzkriegs in military history, moving faster than even German forces had managed in Poland during World War II. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur paced his office at the Daiichi building, his corncob pipe clenched between his teeth. At 70 years old, the legendary commander had already cemented his place in military history through the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Now, as Supreme Commander of Allied Powers in Japan and Commander of United Nations forces in Korea, he faced perhaps his greatest challenge. "The enemy," MacArthur observed to his staff, "has made a terrible mistake." While others saw only impending defeat, MacArthur recognized opportunity. The North Korean advance had been brilliant, but reckless. In their headlong rush southward, they had extended their supply lines dangerously, leaving their western flank exposed along the Yellow Sea. Their forces were concentrated on the Pusan perimeter, believing victory was at hand. Most critically, they had dismissed the possibility of an amphibious landing at Inchon, the port city leading to Seoul, due to its notorious natural obstacles, treacherous mudflats, a narrow channel, and tides that varied by more than 30 feet. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, had grave concerns about an amphibious assault at Inchon. "The best I can say is that Inchon is not impossible," he remarked during planning sessions. In Sitio, Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were skeptical. President Harry Truman's administration, still reeling from the shock of the North Korean invasion, feared another military disaster might necessitate the use of atomic weapons. The stakes could not have been higher, yet MacArthur remained resolute. During a pivotal meeting on August 23rd, he delivered an impassioned 2-hour speech to a room of doubting military leaders. "We shall land at Inchon, and I shall crush them," he declared with the theatrical flair that had become his trademark. Drawing on his experience from the Pacific War, MacArthur argued that Inchon's very difficulties made it the perfect target. The enemy would never expect an attack there. As August turned to September, a massive armada began to assemble. The I-7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Arthur D. Struble, gathered ships from 8 different nations. Major General Edward Almond was selected to command X-Corps, the ground forces for the operation. Detailed planning continued around the clock. In the sweltering confines of the Pusan perimeter, American and South Korean soldiers fought desperately, unaware that their commander was preparing one of the most audacious gambits in modern military history, a massive amphibious landing that would come to be known as Operation Chromite. Through the first week of September 1950, an immense naval armada materialized in Japanese ports. Over 230 ships assembled for what would become one of history's most daring amphibious operations. The 1st Marine Division, hastily reconstituted after post-World War II drawdowns, formed the operation's spearhead. Many of these Marines were veterans of bloody Pacific campaigns at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. Others were fresh recruits who had never seen combat. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, a legendary Marine commander with 5 Navy crosses to his name, prepared his first Marine regiment for the coming battle. "We've been looking for a fight all summer," he told his men with characteristic bluntness, "and now we're going to get it." Aboard the USS Mount McKinley, the command ship for the operation, General MacArthur maintained an outward appearance of supreme confidence. In private moments, however, even he acknowledged the operation's enormous risks. An aide later recalled finding the general alone at night, studying maps of Inchon and muttering, "It can be done. It will be done." Documents from the U.S. Naval Institute reveal that Navy planners estimated the operation had only a 50% chance of success, with naval commanders particularly concerned about the narrow flying fish channel that approached Inchon Harbor. The tide at Inchon presented a formidable challenge. Rising and falling more than 30 feet twice daily, it created vast mudflats that could strand landing craft and doom the entire operation. The Marines would have only a brief window, approximately 3 hours, during which the tide would be high enough to approach the seawall. Miss that window, and the entire force would be stranded on the mudflats, easy targets for North Korean gunners. Naval planners determined that September 15th would provide the necessary high tides. This date left little room for error in the already compressed timeline. Meanwhile, to maintain the element of surprise, an elaborate deception plan unfolded. Feints and diversionary attacks were planned for the east coast of Korea. Radio traffic suggested amphibious operations might target Kunsan or other locations. American intelligence leaked false information through channels they suspected were compromised. As the fleet prepared to sail, intelligence reports from Korea painted an increasingly grim picture. North Korean forces had launched what they hoped would be their final offensive against the Pusan perimeter on September 1st. United Nations forces bent but did not break under the assault. The NKPA remained confident. Their commanders, many trained in Soviet military doctrine, considered the war's outcome nearly settled. They paid little attention to the western coastal approaches, focusing instead on delivering the knockout blow at Pusan. At Inchon itself, they maintained only a token force of fewer than 2,000 troops. 5 days before the landing on September 10th, the U.S. cruiser USS Rochester and the destroyer USS Brush began shelling the approaches to Inchon. That same day, carrier-based aircraft commenced strikes against transportation infrastructure throughout Western Korea, including bridges and railways leading to Inchon and Seoul. 2 days later, on September 13th, a daring operation commenced to capture Wolmi-do, a small island in Inchon Harbor that dominated the approaches. U.S. destroyers engaged in a fierce gun duel with North Korean shore batteries, while Navy, underwater demolition teams, the predecessors to modern Navy SEALs, conducted reconnaissance of the landing beaches. Throughout these preliminary operations, American commanders held their breath, watching for signs that the North Koreans had divined their true intentions. Would reinforcements suddenly appear at Inchon? Would the element of surprise be lost? In the early morning hours of September 15th, the massive invasion fleet approached the Flying Fish Channel. Aboard the USS Mount McKinley, MacArthur donned his trademark cap and sunglasses. The time for planning had ended. The moment of truth had arrived. "The die is cast," MacArthur reportedly told his staff as the first wave of Marines prepared to land. "This will be the most significant operation in the Korean campaign." Dawn broke with a thunderous roar on September 15, 1950, as naval gunfire from 6 American cruisers and dozens of destroyers pounded Wolmi-do Island. The battleship USS Missouri, veteran of World War II, unleashed her 16-inch guns in a devastating barrage that shook the very foundations of Inchon. Aircraft from Task Force 77 screamed overhead, dropping bombs and napalm on North Korean positions. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of Marines from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, landed on Wolmi-do. The island, connected to Inchon by a narrow causeway, had to be secured before the main landing could proceed. Despite intense preparation, military planners held their breath. This was the moment when they would discover if their surprise had been compromised. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, watched anxiously from the command ship. A veteran of Peleliu and other Pacific campaigns, Smith knew well the cost of amphibious assaults. "We'll know in the first 15 minutes, he reportedly told his staff. The answer came quickly. Despite the overwhelming firepower directed at their positions, North Korean resistance on Wolmi-do proved remarkably light. By noon, the Marines had secured the island at a cost of just 17 casualties. The North Koreans had been caught completely unaware. According to declassified documents from the U.S. National Archives, North Korean radio traffic intercepted during the initial landing showed total confusion among NKPA commanders, with one message plaintively asking, "What does it mean that the enemy has landed at Inchon?" With Wolmi-do secured, the Marines prepared for the main landing, scheduled for the afternoon high tide. General MacArthur, against the advice of his staff, insisted on personally observing the operation from the USS Mount McKinley. As the landing craft carrying the 5th Marines' first wave approached Green Beach at exactly 5:33 in the afternoon, MacArthur stood on the bridge, binoculars trained on the seawall. The landing presented challenges unlike any other amphibious operation. The 30-foot seawall hadn't been breached by preliminary bombardment. Marines would need to scale it using ladders while potentially under fire, a daunting prospect reminiscent of medieval siege warfare rather than modern combat. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond L. Murray led the 5th Marines toward the seawall. As landing craft ground against the harbor bottom, Marines scrambled out, carrying scaling ladders. North Korean defenders, still reeling from the morning's bombardment and the unexpected nature of the attack, offered sporadic resistance. By nightfall, the 5th Marines had secured their beachhead and pushed inland. Shortly after, the 1st Marines under Colonel Puller landed at Red Beach, facing similarly light opposition. Within 24 hours of the initial landing, the entire 1st Marine Division was ashore with its equipment and supplies. The gamble had paid off spectacularly. MacArthur's prediction of surprise had been vindicated. The North Korean High Command, focused on their offensive at Pusan, had been caught completely off guard by this strike at their rear. In Seoul, just 20 miles from Inchon, panic spread through North Korean headquarters. Frantic orders went out to redirect forces to counter this unexpected threat. But with most combat units committed to the Pusan front, few troops were available to throw against the Marines. By dawn on September 16th, Exit Corps had secured Inchon and was pushing toward Kimpo Airfield, the largest in Korea. The lightning advance stunned military observers worldwide. The landing, which many had predicted would be a bloodbath, had been executed with minimal casualties. At the Pusan perimeter, General Walker received the news of the successful landing with relief. He immediately began planning for his breakout offensive, which would catch the North Korean forces in a vice between his 8th Army and MacArthur's X-Corps. The tide of war had turned in a single audacious stroke, proving again an age-old military maxim: surprise, properly executed, can overcome even the most formidable odds. By September 17, 1950, just 2 days after the landing, the 1st Marine Division had secured Kimpo Airfield. This crucial capture allowed American transport planes to begin landing reinforcements and supplies directly at the beachhead, accelerating the buildup of forces. More importantly, land-based fighter aircraft could now provide close air support for the advance on Seoul. General MacArthur, ever conscious of the psychological impact of military operations, ordered the immediate restoration of the airfield. Within hours of its capture, the 1st Air Force F-51 Mustangs touched down, tangible evidence of how dramatically the strategic situation had shifted. The North Korean response remained disorganized and piecemeal. Having committed most of their reserves to the Pusan offensive, they struggled to cobble together a coherent defense. Nevertheless, as the Marines approached Seoul, resistance stiffened. NKPA commanders finally grasped the existential threat posed by the Inchon landing and began frantically redeploying forces to protect the capital. Colonel Lewis Puller's 1st Marines encountered the first serious opposition at a key bridge over the Han River. North Korean troops dug into the hills overlooking the crossing, poured fire onto the advancing Marines. Puller, observing the situation from an exposed position, reportedly growled to his staff, "We're going across that river if I have to build a bridge with Marine bodies." War correspondents from the Associated Press who accompanied the Marines reported that the fighting grew increasingly intense as UN forces approached Seoul, with North Korean defenders fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were cut off from escape. By September 20th, the battle for Seoul had begun in earnest. Unlike the relatively bloodless landing at Inchon, the fight for the capital turned into a brutal urban struggle. The NKPA, reinforced by elements withdrawn from the Pusan front, turned Seoul into a fortress. Every street, every building became a battleground. Major General Edward Almond, commanding X-Corps, pressed for rapid conquest of the city. MacArthur had set an ambitious goal: recapture Seoul within 10 days of the landing by September 25th. This date held symbolic significance as the 3-month anniversary of the North Korean invasion. The pressure for speed conflicted with the reality of urban warfare. General Smith, the Marine commander, worried about unnecessary casualties from a hasty advance. "If you try to rush it, all you do is get a lot of people killed," he cautioned. The tension between Almond's aggressive timetable and Smith's more methodical approach created friction in the command structure. Meanwhile, far to the southeast, the 8th Army under General Walker had launched its breakout from the Pusan perimeter on September 16th. North Korean forces, already shaken by news of the Inchon landing, found themselves attacked from both front and rear. Their supply lines cut, their reinforcements diverted. The once formidable NKPA offensive collapsed. Inside Seoul, the Marines fought block by block, building by building. Civilian casualties mounted as North Korean troops used the city's population as shields. The historic capital, already damaged by fighting during the initial invasion, suffered further destruction. Captain Robert Barrow, commanding a company of the 1st Marines, later recalled the intensity of the combat. "The city was like a gigantic house of horrors, with snipers firing from shattered windows and machine guns sweeping the streets. We'd clear a building, move on, and then have to clear it again when infiltrators slipped back in." By September 25th, exactly as MacArthur had demanded, the Marines secured the heart of Seoul, including the government house. Though pockets of resistance remained, the capital was effectively under United Nations control once more. On September 29th, General MacArthur presided over a ceremony restoring the city to President Syngman Rhee's government. In typical fashion, MacArthur delivered a dramatic address. "Mr. President, by the grace of a merciful providence, our forces fighting under the standard of that greatest hope and inspiration of mankind, the United Nations, have liberated this ancient capital city of Korea." The liberation of Seoul marked the completion of one of the most successful military operations in modern history. In just 2 weeks, the strategic situation on the Korean peninsula had been completely reversed. The North Korean forces, on the verge of total victory in early September, now faced catastrophic defeat. By the first days of October 1950, what had begun as a fighting retreat for North Korean forces transformed into a complete collapse. The NKPA, once a formidable fighting force on the verge of victory, disintegrated under the pressure of attacks from both MacArthur's forces from Inchon and Walker's 8th Army driving northward from Pusan. The brilliant envelopment strategy, devised by MacArthur, had worked beyond even his optimistic projections. North Korean supply lines were severed, communications broken, and command structures shattered. Thousands of NKPA soldiers, cut off from their leadership and supplies, abandoned their weapons and uniforms, attempting to blend into the civilian population or flee northward in small groups. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army's northward drive, later remarked, "We had anticipated a fighting retreat to the 38th parallel. Instead, we encountered a rout." American and South Korean forces captured enormous quantities of abandoned Soviet-made equipment, tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles, often with their engines still running. Military historians from the U.S. Army Center of Military History have described the collapse of North Korean forces following the Inchon landing as one of the most complete battlefield defeats in modern warfare, comparable to the German collapse in France in 1944. On October 1st, RUK, Republic of Korea, forces crossed the 38th parallel, the pre-war boundary between North and South. This momentous event transformed the conflict from a war to repel invasion to something more complex and fraught with international implications. In Washington, President Truman and his advisors faced a difficult decision. The original United Nations mandate had authorized force to repel the North Korean invasion and restore South Korean sovereignty. Now, with that goal essentially accomplished, should UN forces halt at the parallel, or should they push into North Korea to eliminate the communist regime? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, emboldened by the success at Inchon, supported MacArthur's plan to advance into North Korea and achieve a complete victory. Secretary of State Dean Acheson argued that stopping at the parallel would only allow Kim Il-sung's regime to regroup and attack again when conditions favored them. On October 7th, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 376, authorizing forces to take all appropriate steps to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. Though carefully worded to avoid explicitly sanctioning an invasion of North Korea, the resolution effectively gave MacArthur the green light to continue northward. As UN forces drove deeper into North Korean territory, they encountered diminishing resistance. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, fell on October 19th. American and South Korean troops were welcomed as liberators by many North Koreans, who had lived under the oppressive communist regime for 5 years. The stunning reversal of fortune generated near euphoria among UN commanders. General MacArthur, meeting with President Truman on Wake Island on October 15th, confidently predicted that the war would be over by Christmas. When asked about the possibility of Chinese intervention, MacArthur dismissed the concern, asserting that China would not dare enter the conflict. By late October, advanced elements of the 8th Army had reached the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and China. The war that had begun with North Korean tanks rumbling across the 38th parallel now appeared to be reaching its conclusion on the banks of the Yalu. The North Korean regime seemed on the verge of total collapse. Few among the triumphant UN forces noticed the ominous signs: unusual nighttime movements across the river, strange encounters with troops who were not North Korean, intelligence reports of massive Chinese troop concentrations in Manchuria. Those who did raise concerns were often dismissed. The victory at Inchon had created a dangerous sense of invincibility. Major General Oliver Smith of the 1st Marine Division remained cautious. As his forces advanced northeast toward the Chosin Reservoir, he ordered extensive supply dumps and fortified fallback positions established along their route. Precautions that would prove prescient in the weeks to come. On October 25th, the first Chinese volunteers made contact with ROK forces near the Yalu. Initially dismissed as isolated incidents, these clashes were the harbinger of a massive Chinese intervention that would once again transform the Korean War. The brilliant success of Inchon and its aftermath had sown the seeds of a new crisis. The very completeness of the victory over North Korean forces had created a strategic blindness, a failure to recognize that a new and more formidable adversary was preparing to enter the conflict. As UN forces pressed northward through the Korean Peninsula in late October 1950, few could have predicted how dramatically the war would change in the coming weeks. The spectacular success of the Inchon landing had reshaped the conflict, transforming certain defeat into apparent victory. Yet that very success contained the seeds of future challenges that would test the limits of American military power. Chinese intervention in November would send UN forces reeling southward in one of the longest retreats in American military history. The war that MacArthur had confidently predicted would end by Christmas would instead drag on for 2.5 more years, ultimately ending in a stalemate around the original 38th parallel. Despite these later developments, military historians continue to regard the Inchon landing as a masterpiece of operational art. In the annals of warfare, few operations have so perfectly demonstrated the military principle that boldness and surprise can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. In his definitive work, The Coldest Winter, historian David Halberstam wrote, "Inchon remains the quintessential example of how audacity and perfect execution can dramatically reverse a strategic situation. It stands as MacArthur's finest hour, a brilliant conception flawlessly implemented. The planning and execution of Operation Chromite offers enduring lessons for military professionals. Chief among these is the value of calculated risk-taking. When MacArthur proposed landing at Inchon, conventional military wisdom deemed it too hazardous. The tides, the narrow approach channel, the seawall, all presented formidable obstacles. Yet MacArthur recognized that these very difficulties made Inchon the perfect target precisely because the enemy would never expect an attack there. The says, "History of war is the history of surprise," MacArthur had told his doubtful colleagues during the planning phase. The Inchon landing vindicated this principle spectacularly. The operation also demonstrated the decisive impact of joint operations. The success at Inchon resulted from the seamless integration of naval, air, and ground forces. Naval gunfire and carrier-based aviation prepared the landing zones. Amphibious forces secured the beachhead. Ground forces exploited the landing to drive inland. Each component was essential, and their coordination represented military teamwork at its finest. For the Marines, Inchon represented a powerful validation of their specialized amphibious warfare doctrine. After World War II, some military planners had questioned the continued relevance of amphibious operations in the nuclear age. Inchon silenced these doubts, demonstrating that the ability to project power from the sea remained a vital capability. The Inchon landing also highlighted the importance of leadership. MacArthur's conception of the operation required moral courage to champion against widespread skepticism. The field commanders, Almond, Smith, and their subordinates, translated the audacious plan into operational reality through meticulous preparation and disciplined execution. Perhaps most significantly, Inchon illustrated the enduring military principle that position can be more important than mass. The North Koreans had numerical superiority in the theater, but the landing at Inchon placed UN forces in a position that negated this advantage. By striking at the enemy's rear, MacArthur achieved strategic paralysis of North Korean forces that no frontal assault could have accomplished. The Korean War would ultimately become America's forgotten war, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after. Yet within military circles, the Inchon landing has never been forgotten. It remains required study at war colleges worldwide, analyzed for its perfect synthesis of daring, deception, and execution. In the decades that followed, American military planners would repeatedly look to Inchon as inspiration when facing seemingly intractable tactical situations. The operation provided a powerful reminder that imagination, courage, and surprise can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. Douglas MacArthur, whose lengthy career had many triumphs and controversies, considered Inchon his greatest achievement. When asked years later about the operation, he simply said, "The bulk of the credit should go to the planners and the fighting men who executed the operation. I merely perceived the opportunity and approved the plan." Such modesty belied MacArthur's central role in conceiving and championing the operation. Inchon stands as his masterpiece, a brilliant stroke that, even if only temporarily, turned the tide of war through the perfect application of surprise. For the men who stormed ashore on that September day, Inchon represented something more personal, a validation of their training, their courage, and their sacrifice. As one Marine later put it, "We did the impossible because nobody told us we couldn't."